Hey everybody, this is Bo Sanders. I am back this week to talk about religion. So in the next 10 minutes, we're going to tackle this massive category of religion. And I think it's important to do so because we in the 21st century have inherited a very bad paradigm description of what religion is. Most people think that it's either entirely true, the tradition that they have inherited, or that it's a fairy tale like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy, and because we know how it evolved from, say, nature worship with lightning gods and fertility ceremonies, that we can explain it away. So that's a reductive move that explains it away. Or we get a fundamentalist, foundationalist paradigm that says it is entirely true, you cannot move a single stone or the whole building will crumble. So today I want to present to you a different idea, not built on foundation stones that can't be adjusted and moved, that can't respond to tension. I want to talk about religion as a web of meaning. And so I just want to introduce that a famous kind of way of talking about religion is inherited from a Buddhist story about 6 blind men with their hand on an elephant. And each of them, depending on where their hand is, thinks that they have the totality of the picture. So one has their hand on the side and describes it as a wall. One has their hand on the leg and describes it as a tree trunk. One has their hand on the trunk and talks about it as a rope. One has their hand on the tail, describes it as a unique brush. One has their hand on the ear and describes it as a giant leaf. And one has their hand on the tusk and describes it as a spear. Each thinking they have the whole picture. And so we get this thing from Kant, Immanuel Kant, that says, and yet all of them were wrong, but we, in our enlightened position, we really get what's going on in religion, in our elevated, enlightened position. And I think we need to be careful with that, because that inherited explanation divides things between the phenomenal that we experience, the phenomenon, and the noumenal, which we don't ever have access to. And that binary, that dichotomy, is very, very unhelpful. So instead of the true, false, the noumenal, phenomenal split that we've inherited, I want to get away from those false binaries and those dichotomies, and I want to talk about religion as 5 interrelated elements that compose a web of meaning. So here are the 5 as I see them. The first is experience. There is something in religion that people experience, especially if you talk to converts. Now I'm going to use Christianity, and specifically Protestant Christianity, as my example today because that's the tradition that I'm most familiar with. But as I have gone to an interreligious PhD program, and as I have read stuff from other traditions, it seems to hold up across the religious traditions and inherited experience that there is something people genuinely experience, whether you call it the transcendent, whether you call it the divine, the holy. We have a lot of great words for it, but there is an experience. In fact, one of the things that we're watching as people transition out of the religion that they were raised in is because they don't experience the truths that are proclaimed or that the tradition says should happen. And when that gap between a theory and a practice or an idea and an experience is too great, people will opt out. But that doesn't mean that people aren't experiencing something in their religion. And it's something we have to take account of. In fact, it's the thing for me that is the most intriguing and why I'm in practical theology, which is kind of a sociology of religion, is I want to know about how people experience the tradition and the religion that they're participating in. So that's element 1. So that's one anchor point for the web. A second anchor point is that there is something going on in religion that has to do with formation. And so it's really powerful to understand that if you have learned a religious vocabulary, so for me as a Christian, a Protestant Christian, an evangelical Christian, a charismatic evangelical Christian, there is a learned vocabulary that, and this is where it gets tricky, that not only helps me interpret my experience, which I have to do, but actually forms, in some sense, my experience. Part of the way I experience the world is by either the religious vocabulary I have inherited, or if you're an atheist or an agnostic or a nun or whatever that would be, or a convert to another religion, that you experience by what you have denied or walked away from. But that formation not only helps you interpret your experience, but it also forms, in some sense, that experience. We experience the world through the forms of the vocabulary and the experiences that we've been given. And I can say more about that in a later episode. The third anchor point on our web of meaning is the event. And John Caputo is great at talking about this from a philosophical standpoint, that there is an event housed in the name of God. That when you say God, whatever language you're speaking, that something is getting itself done in the name of God. Elizabeth Johnson would say it a little different. She says that our language about God functions. And I love this idea that there is an event when you mention the name of God. Something is housed in that name. And the example I like to use is if you're having a disagreement over Thanksgiving dinner, and you say, like, I think X and Y about this politician or your girlfriend or whatever, that's one thing. But if I say, God has this opinion, by invoking that name, we're now having a different kind of conversation. God talk is, in a sense, a different type of conversation. God talk is a different type of talk, which brings us to mystery. The thing we cannot forget is that for all of our God talk, for all of our revealed scriptures, for all of our inherited traditions, there is a mystery inherent in religion. I really take after Elizabeth Johnson. She challenged us to say, whenever you say God, you have to say it 3 times. God that is beyond us, God that is at work within us, and God that is in all around us. You have to say God 3 times, especially for us as Christians, as Trinitarians, that we acknowledge there's something that is beyond us. So for all of our confidence and zeal, there's also humility that's required to say that whenever we're talking about God, for as much as we know, there is infinitely more that we don't know. And so there's a humility that's required. Even if we think that God revealed in Scripture everything that we needed to know, we can't be under the impression that that's all there is to know if we believe in an infinite God. So there's a mystery involved. And there's a tradition that Christians have inherited. For some of us, it's gone the way of the dodo, and other people are trying to revive it. And it's called the apophatic tradition, or negativa, that every time we talk about God, we also have to acknowledge that our language is insufficient, and that when we talk about, say, God as Father, that it's an analogy, right? That's analogous language, and that God relates to us as one relates to a father, that's a relational comparison. But that's not the totality of who God is. So God isn't like actually a father. It's that we relate to God as one relates to a father. So every time we say something confident about God, Abba, Father, Daddy, Papa, we also acknowledge that's not exactly all that's true, or that it's all true. And so there's a humility required because there's a great mystery at work. Last anchor point is that there is potentially something real going on in religion. People get really upset with me when I introduce this 5th point, because those who want to say that religion is all true in that Kantian sense that we talked about at the beginning get mad that I add potentially as a modifier, that there is something potentially true. And they say, how dare you? Of course it's real. Well, what are you saying? I mean, people are fooling themselves, whatever. There's potentially something real going on in religion. And then other people who do the very dismissive thing and say, like, look, we know where this comes from, we've seen how it's evolved, we get the history, blah, blah, blah. They get mad, not at the potential part, like the zealots would, but they get mad that I think there might be something real going on at all. So, If you put this all together, instead of having a foundational picture of religion that you set certain stones in place, whether it's revelation or tradition or whatever it is, and that they cannot be moved or the whole building will tumble, we now are moving towards an understanding of religion that is web-based. It is anchored in multiple points, and thus one anchor can be adjusted as needed so that the other anchor points adjust and compensate for that tension, and that we have a place they'll catch us. We don't fall through the cracks. We're not in danger of like structural crumbling, because we understand that in these 5 elements, there is something going on in religion through people's experience, that we are formed by those experiences' interpretation, that there's an event, something is going on, and that God language is a little different kind of language, that there's a mystery involved, and there's potentially something real going on. And in that humility to say neither that we have it all figured out, nor can we completely dismiss it in a reductive sense, opens up the conversation to say that religion, as a web of meaning, has a lot more potential as we go forward in an interreligious world. And so I wanted to throw that out. So that's my 10 minutes on religion. I would love to hear your feedback. Next week we talk about the church. The week after that we talk about the end of the world and life after death. So I encourage you to keep up with these conversations. I'm enjoying them greatly.